Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Chapter 3 lecture. This is a really awesome chapter to review, basically because this chapter is all about our sense of self. So, to recap, in Chapter 1, we learned about the foundations of interpersonal communication. We learned about the importance of the communication model. And most importantly, we learned about how the first steps we need to take in order to become competent interpersonal communicators. And one of those big steps was not only being able to practice empathy, among a lot of other skills, but it was also about knowing who you're speaking to. It was about being able to be adaptable, and chapters 2 and 3 really help us with that. So in chapter 2, we took a big macro or wider approach. We stepped back and we looked at culture from a social scientific point of view to try to understand the different value sets that different cultures have and to understand how we can fit into all of that so that when we are communicating with other people that are different from us, we're much more prepared with that knowledge and that skill that we talked about in chapter 2. And now we're moving on to chapter 3, which is all about communication and the sense of self. And the sense of self is such an interesting concept because instead of taking this wider macro approach that we took with culture in chapter 2, we're now going to dive deeper in and focus on just us as individuals, our sense of selves, who we are, and putting that in the mix. And if we don't understand who we are, how can we expect to be strong, good, competent communicators? Because if we don't know who we are and where we're coming from and our perspectives, we're not fully practicing that skill of self-monitoring that we talked about in chapter 1. Okay? So we're going to go ahead and jump right into this lecture. I hope you all are doing wonderful today. So, communication and the self. And when I say the self in this chapter lecture and when you see it in the textbook, you'll see often that the self is a phrase that we use a lot in communication studies to refer to who we mentally think we are internally in our heads. So, I know that we use the words myself, selfish, and we use a lot of the related words, but try to understand it from this communication studies standpoint. The self simply refers to what I have in blue here on my slides. It is a set of relatively stable perceptions that each of us holds about ourselves, and it is not the same as our self-esteem. So I really want to clarify that. I want to make sure that that's understood. Self-esteem I will cover later in this chapter, but I just want to go out the gate and just say that self-concept, not the same as self-esteem. And I know that students do tend to mix that up a lot, and so it's very important that you have clarification on that. All right? So, what does this definition right here in blue mean? What it means is that we all have a set of ideas of who we think we are inside. And key word in this definition is perception. In the same way that we talked about in chapter 2, culture is is bound by definition and perception. Your sense of self, or who you think you are, is also defined by perception and your definition of it. Okay? Oh, all right, so sorry about that. That skipped a little bit, but as I was saying, the key word in this definition is perception. So in the same way that culture is bound by definition and perception, our sense of self, or who we think we are, is also defined by perception. It's all up to how we perceive internally in our heads who we think we are. But that is, and the best metaphor I can give you is our mental mirror. So you can kind of see this picture that I have right here of this person looking in the mirror. It's when we look at ourselves in our own heads, our self-concept is who we think we are. So I have a video right here from Tandy Newton. She's giving a TED Talk on who she thinks she was. And as someone who was a mixed race woman growing up in another country, she talks about how her sense of self-concept drastically changed all the time, and how she was always constantly coming around looking for a sense of self, wanting that sense of self. So I really encourage you to watch it when you get the chance. It's on my lecture slides. I think she does a great job of kind of breaking down a lot of her life experiences, and those are great examples of the self-concept as a whole. So I would actually recommend reading through the chapter and then going back and listening to Tandy Newton's video, and I think you'll find it quite helpful to bring home a lot of the concepts that we're learning. So communication and the self. So all I've done right here, as you can see in my cursor, is I have broken down the what. So what? So in our lectures, you'll notice that I give a lot of definitions and then I say, well, so what? So I gave you the definition of the self-concept, but why do we care about it as communicators? And one key reason for that is because it is a set of perceptions that you have about yourself in your head. It will affect the way that you communicate with others. If you go back to our chapter 1 lecture and we look at that new communication model that we analyzed, you'll see that speakers A and B both come from different environments, as it says in the model. And a big part of that environment is not just the culture that we covered in chapter 2, but also your sense of self-concept. It's all your perceptions of who you think you are. And who you think you are will impact how you view other people and ultimately how you communicate with them. And so in the last slide, I said that self-concept and self-esteem are not the same, and they are definitely not the same. It's very important that you recognize that self-esteem is a part of your self-concept, so it's a piece of it, and self-esteem deals with the evaluation of your self-worth. How valuable do you see yourself? Are you good? Are you at something? Are you bad at something? Are you intelligent? Do you find yourself attractive? All of that is part of your self-worth. Do you think you are capable, ultimately, is what your self-esteem is about. But that's just a small piece of your self-concept, because your self-concept also involves your identity as well, which relates to your sense of worth, but isn't all about your sense of worth. So where does this self-concept come from? Because we're not just naturally born with this sense of self, right? So if you think about it as babies, we don't just get born with this idea of, well, this is who I am, and I understand everything about who I am and my relationship to everybody else in the world. Of course you don't. And so you begin to learn your sense of self quite early in childhood. The first step obviously would be getting a name. So your parents give you a name, and then that becomes part of your self-concept. And for some of you, your name may mean something as part of your culture or your family heritage. You might be named after another family member, for example. You might be named after a religious figure in your religion. And so depending on what your parents named you, they may or may not have had different aspirations for you. So the name is a fantastic example of where we get our first steps of what our self-concept is, who we are and what our purpose is, and who we are in relationship to other people. The two words I have here in orange and pink, you'll see covered in the first forefront of your chapter. And so let's talk a little bit again about how we build our self-concept from birth until adulthood, well into our late adulthood. So one of the key ways we do that is through this pink word that I have right here, reflected appraisal. So that is the process of mirroring the judgments of other people. And we don't mirror the judgments of all people, because that would be impossible to do. We mirror the judgments of people that we perceive, keyword perceive, are important to us, or that we value, or that we admire. And so in communication studies, we refer to these people as significant others. I know that we use the word significant other to mean romantic partner in everyday language, but in the context of communication studies, significant other can mean anyone, including your romantic partner. It can really mean anyone whose opinion you value, who you respect, who you want to impress. That could be your parents, your teacher, your grandmother, your coach, whoever it is that you really want to impress, who you care about, whose opinions you care about, whose relationship you have with that you care about, is a significant other. And these people, because we care so much about what they think of us, their evaluations of us are particularly influential. For a majority of people, the first significant others that you have in your life are your parents. And so the judgments of your parents are significantly influential to children, particularly because they are the most trusted adults that a child comes into contact with on a regular basis. And typically that is where children receive their love and their care and their affection and their first sense of socialization. And it doesn't, of course, have to be your biological parents. It could be just anyone who's your caregiver, your caretaker, that primary person or persons in your life that take care of you when you are young and not able to take care of yourself yet. And so when we experience reflected appraisal, we mirror those judgments from other people. So if I am let's say I'm a child and I'm playing soccer, but I'm not playing very well. If my significant other is my coach, or one of my significant others is my coach, and they encourage me and they say, hey, I know you're not doing well, but I think you definitely could do well, and I think you need to try more. I will mirror that judgment and say, yeah, I just think I just need to try more. And so we find that that reflected appraisal of either being complimented or put down, because appraisal isn't just positive, it can also be negative. My coach could also say, oh, you're never going to be a good soccer player, you should just give up right now. And guess what? I'm going to mirror that judgment most likely, and I'm going to give up. And so reflected appraisal, particularly for children, is incredibly important, because when you are so young and still learning about your sense of self, that is a majority of where you build your sense of self, and ultimately where you extract your sense of self-esteem as well. But of course, this doesn't just extend to children. This is something that adults experience as well. So when you get a romantic partner, when you grow older and have different significant others in your life, it could be, for example, your boss at work even. We begin to mirror those people's judgments on a regular basis based off the verbal and nonverbal appraisals that they give us, both negative and positive, okay? The second way that we develop our self-concept is social comparison. So unlike reflected appraisal, which is a more external way of developing the sense of self, social comparison is a more internal way of evaluating ourselves. So this is a way where we mentally, inside our own heads, and we've all done it, compare ourselves to other people that we see similar to us. So for example, if you are in college and you're taking a class, you may compare your progress in the class or your experience in the class or your performance in the class to a fellow classmate that you see as similar to you. So someone who's the same in age, someone who's your friend, someone who you see as equal to you in educational ability. So we compare ourselves to people so that we can evaluate our own characteristics. And what we understand from reflected appraisal and social comparison are two things. So why do we care? We care because the fact that we build a big part of our self-concept from reflected appraisal, meaning words both and nonverbal behaviors from other people, and we build our self-concept from internal social comparison to other people, so we are internally doing it, but yet we're still comparing ourselves to other people. What that really tells us is that a big majority of our self-concept comes from other people, comes from socialization. So this all links back to chapters 2 and 1, because we talked so much at length about how we are naturally social creatures that truly enjoy socializing with other people and even have a very strong need to socialize with other people in order to be happy, healthy, and thriving. And so a huge part, if not almost all of it, of our self-concept comes from other people. It comes from knowing who we are in relationship to other people. And it's safe to say, for example, if you grew up absolutely by yourself in a mountain in the Himalayas somewhere and you never met another human being, your self-concept might be completely different and not at all dependent on other people. It might be that you don't even have a self-concept that is as stable as someone who is more social and is around other human beings. So whether we're in small communities, large communities, we get our sense of self-concept from other people, either through their appraisal or by comparing ourselves to them. All right. So now that we have covered that aspect, let's look at the characteristics of the self-concept. How does it play out internally in our minds as well as externally when we are trying to communicate? The first key thing to remember is that the self-concept is subjective, and I put this in bold right here for a reason. The way that we view ourselves may not be the same way that we view others, and I would say that it's safe to say that a majority of the time, the way that we view ourselves is most likely definitely not the same way that others view us. We have a very skewed perception of ourselves because of the following reasons that I have here in A, B, C, and D. The key thing is that we tend to think that others have the same view of us as we have of us. And so that's kind of the trap that we walk into when we're communicating with other people, because we assume that they're thinking about us what we think about us. One example I can give you is Oftentimes students will tell me about starting a new job, and when my students start a new job, obviously they have new supervisors or new bosses that they have to answer to. And of course, when you start a new job, you're going to make mistakes, and that's quite common. You're probably going to make mistakes for a very long time, me included. I make them all the time. And so my students would talk about how when they would make a mistake, it would really impact what they thought of their capabilities at work. It would impact their self-esteem and ultimately start bleeding into their sense of self-concept. They would start questioning, oh, did I pick the right field? Am I right for this job? Am I even smart enough to do this job? Am I capable enough to do this job? And they would start questioning themselves and start seeing themselves as not a good doctor or lawyer or teacher or engineer or whatever it is that they were. And whenever they would communicate with their boss, they had this unknown assumption, unconscious assumption that their boss also thought that of them, that their boss was looking at them as not capable at their job, when in fact their boss either really enjoyed their job performance or felt that their job performance needed improvement, but definitely did not think, oh, you're not capable. And so we can see that the way we assume other people think the same way that we think about ourselves can run us into some strong communication conflicts and problems, which we'll get into later chapters. It's really important to hit that note here so that when we do visit it in later chapters, you understand how that self-concept continues to play out over and over and over again. You'll definitely see it play out in our next chapter 4 on perception, and you'll definitely see it play out in our chapter on conflict. Okay? So, looking at A, B, C, and D here, like I said, the reason for why we view ourselves is as the reason for why the way we view ourselves is not the same way others view us is because of these 4 reasons that I put here. First, it's based on obsolete information. So we might be anxiously stressing out about one mistake we did or one other thing that happened, and honestly, no one else remembers it, or maybe no one else really cares. But we see it as very important information, and we end up focusing heavily on that last mistake that we did, or that joke that we told that didn't make sense, or that last thing that happened that seemed really important to us at the time, but isn't quite that important to other people. The second thing is that we get distorted feedback from other people. Remember that we're all human beings, and so we all have self-concepts, meaning that all those other people that you are interacting with on a regular basis also have self-concepts that are all of the above based on obsolete information. They get distorted feedback from other people. They ignore negative qualities and they view themselves harshly. So it's a constant circle where we are getting feedback from other people, but that feedback might be distorted. It might be inaccurate. We might be decoding it incorrectly. So if we go back to our chapter 1 model, remember that the receiver of any message has to accurately decode it and then provide feedback. We may not be decoding someone else's message correctly. So someone might just give us a suggestion and we take it as criticism, for example. And that criticism for us becomes a sort of reflected appraisal that we then take in to build our sense of self-concept. So just because we have feedback from other people, that doesn't always necessarily mean we take it in correctly or interpret it correctly. And that may be because of the way they deliver the message. It may be because we just don't know how to decode the message. It might be a combination of both. But I think there is no human on this earth that has always accurately taken in someone else's feedback. And I'm sure you can all agree on that. C, we ignore negative qualities. So at times when we want to protect our sense of self-concept, we will ignore negative qualities about ourselves, our thoughts, our feelings, our perceptions to protect ourselves. Remember that you've been building this self-concept since birth, and so you're very protective of it. You're very passionate about it. It's who you are. It's your sense of identity. And so we sometimes ignore our own negative qualities or the negative qualities of things that we believe in or hold dear to us because we want to protect that sense of self-concept. An interesting study came out of Pew Research that found that currently in this 2016, 2017, 2018 atmosphere that we have right now in the United States, we tend to double down on our opinions, even when our opinions are proven empirically incorrect. What that means is that I could say, for example, I believe that the sky is pink. And one of you could tell me, no, look, you can visually see that the sky is blue. And our research at Pew has found that even when confronted with empirical, objective evidence that we are wrong about a belief that we had, we will actually, instead of just changing our minds or recognizing that we're wrong, we'll actually double down on it and be like, no, this guy is pink. I'm pretty sure it's pink, and that's a shade of pink. And so it's quite interesting to see this research come out now about how protective we are getting about our sense of self-concept. So fun tidbit for you there. Lastly, we also view ourselves harshly. So how is it possible that we ignore our own negative qualities, but we're also our own worst critic? And the answer I can give to you that is the mind is a very complex thing. The self-concept is a very complex thing. So we might ignore certain negative qualities of other aspects of our lives, but then we might view ourselves more harshly in different aspects. I know that I'm for example, very, very critical of myself when it comes to my work. I'm very critical of myself when it comes to anything involving my students and my lectures and collaborating with my colleagues. I tend to really view myself harshly in that light, but I do tend to ignore negative qualities when it comes to like my exercise or my diet. So I know internally I should exercise more, I should eat a little bit healthier, but I tend to just ignore those negative qualities about myself and that laziness in my diet. So we can see there from that example that we can at the same time be kind to ourselves and ignore other negative qualities in one aspect of our self-concept, but then be very harsh to ourselves in other concepts. And I'm sure for all of you in different areas of your life, your work, your personal life, your school life, whatever it may be, you may view yourself harshly in one or maybe a majority of those areas. So self-reflect on that as well. It's super awesome to kind of sit back and think of the ways that you view yourself in different roles in your life. The key thing, though, to take away from this portion of the lecture is what I've written in pink down here. A healthy self-concept is flexible. It changes as needed to remain realistic. So while a self-concept is definitely stable, meaning that you can't wake up one day and feel like you have a whole new identity, that's definitely not stable. But one of the key parts of a self-concept is that it should be stable and flexible at the same time. You should be able to develop and change your self-concept as you continue through your life. So, for example, we find that the self-concept has a huge awakening and growth between the ages of about 18 to 26, 28 on average. We found initially that we thought the brain finished developing around the ages of 18 to 21 way back when. And now modern science has found that our brain actually continues developing most actively from the ages of 18 all the way up until about 26 for females, 28 on average for males. And that's so interesting because what are you doing during that time of your life? For a majority of you, you might be in school, you might be starting a new job, you might be starting a family, and so all those experiences that you're having during that key time is influencing your self-concept incredibly, especially because your brain is still developing. But that doesn't mean that 25-year-old you is going to be the same as 35-year-old you or 45-year-old you, right? You're going to continue developing in your opinions, your perspectives, your experiences, your thoughts and beliefs, and your self-concept needs to catch up with that. So, for example, if you will ever become a parent, are planning on becoming a parent, or are a parent, I'm sure the moment that you become a parent, your self-concept is going to take a huge change because now you have to integrate into your identity parent, right? You have to integrate into your identity father or mother or grandparent or uncle or aunt. That now becomes part of your identity and will change your self-concept. But if you resist that change, your self-concept may or may not be healthy, and then therefore your relationships may not be healthy as well. So very important that you're always open for that self-concept to be slowly edited and changed so that it can remain realistic over time. Okie dokie. Let's move right through this. So, the fun, I know I just said that, oh yeah, our self-concept should be flexible and it should change and rainbows and unicorns. But but it doesn't change. The self-concept definitely resists change. And as you can see why, as I talked about earlier, the self-concept definitely wants to protect itself from change or anything that it perceives as attacking it. And sometimes learning new things about the world, about yourself, about other people that you are in a relationship with, whether it's your family or your friends or your romantic partner, can be really difficult to absorb into your sense of self-concept. Sometimes, as with my last example, becoming a parent can be really difficult. And it doesn't happen overnight, right? It's not like you have a child and you're like, bing, and you have like a software update in you, iOS software update that just says, oh, but now you're a parent. It's a slow development over time because the self-concept resists change. And it has to, like I said, to protect itself. You can't radically be changing all the time. The self-concept does, as we mentioned earlier, has to stay stable, at least relatively stable, throughout your life, and has slow, small changes as it moves on. The tendency to resist revision in our self-concept is strong. And so if you have ever heard that human beings are creatures of habit, that person who told you that is absolutely right. We are definitely creatures of habit. And what we practice in order to protect our existing self-concept is called cognitive conservatism. So remember in chapter 1, we talked about cognitive complexity, which is the ability to see multiple points of view, perspectives, and understand them and apply them in our communication settings. Cognitive conservatism is when we are faced with new ideas, we conservatively resist those. We are conservative with those ideas. We resist them. We don't take them into our self-concept. We don't see them as valid or as something that can be part of our sense of self-concept, specifically because we see them as attacking our sense of self-concept. This relates heavily to that Pew Research that I mentioned earlier in this lecture when we talked about resisting changing our opinions, even when our opinions are proven empirically incorrectly. Okay? So one aspect or one practice of cognitive conservatism is the self-fulfilling prophecy, as you can see right here in red. It occurs when a person's expectation of an event affects his or her behavior and therefore makes the predicted outcome more likely to occur than would otherwise have been true. So this belief about the outcome ultimately affects your communication, and that's why we care about it. So let me break down the self-fulfilling prophecy. The first key word in here that you see is expectation of an event. So your attitude about an event, your belief about what you think is going to happen, will affect your behavior. And because it affected your behavior, the outcome that you thought was going to happen happens. So let me give you an example of how this works. Let's say that you are like me and you're not very good at math. I've definitely sucked a lot at math all the way into college. And I definitely practiced a lot of self-fulfilling prophecies where I told myself, why should I study for this math exam? I'm going to fail it anyway. So there you go. I have an expectation, right, of an event. So I expect myself to fail no matter what. And because I expected myself to fail, I said, well, why bother studying? I'm not going to study, right? And so because of that, I didn't study. And guess what happens when you don't study, especially for math exams? You fail them, right? And so once I would fail my math exam, I would look back in hindsight and say, oh, see, I was right. Why did I even bother studying? I was totally right to not study because look, I failed anyway. And the hiccup about that is that I don't realize that I failed my math exam not because I couldn't pass or that I wouldn't be capable, but because my attitude made me not study, and that was the cause of me failing, not that it would have happened no matter what. So we call these self-fulfilling prophecies because we get into our own heads about our expectations about what will happen. Those expectations dictate our behavior, and then that behavior leads into making that prophecy that we had happen in the first place. But because it happens so quickly and fluidly, and because we're practicing cognitive conservatism, we don't notice that we're doing this to ourselves. But we oftentimes dictate the outcome of what will happen based on our attitude and our mindset going into it. And so I am a huge advocate for positive mindset and a growth mindset when it comes to tough things like work or school or developing relationships in your personal life, because I would say that your attitude is a huge, huge, huge part of how you will behave in any given situation, and ultimately how you behave in any given situation will always affect the outcome of that situation. So think about that, especially as we are moving into deeper chapters where we investigate our perceptions and challenge our sense of perceptions of the world and of ourselves. And also always study for your math exams. Don't be like me. So there's two types of self-fulfilling prophecies we can engage in. Self-imposed is when you occur, like the one I just described, where you influence your own behavior. But we can also have other imposed prophecies where other people can give us expectations, and then it governs our own actions. So sometimes someone else might tell us, hey, what's the point of studying for this exam? We're not going to pass anyway, let's both not study. And you trust that person, so you listen to them, and then you both fail the exam, and they're like, see, I was right, we were going to fail anyway, so why would we waste time studying? So self-fulfilling prophecies can occur when other people also influence your attitude or your behavior about something. But the key thing to remember about self-fulfilling prophecies is that they have three pieces. So they have the expectation or the attitude, right? So you expect something to happen. That attitude or behavior then governs your behavior about it. So you have your expectation makes you behave a certain way. And then finally, the third piece is your prophecy occurs because your behavior made it so to occur. Okay? Always remember that there's those three aspects there. Next. So, identity management is another way that our self-concept plays out. So self-fulfilling prophecy is one way. Identity management is another way. And identity management refers to a set of communication strategies that people use to present the self and to influence how others view them. So you can see here that I've written it in pink. Let me scroll down over here so you can see it. But it refers to this idea that people will use varying communication strategies, both verbal and nonverbal, to present their sense of self and to influence or persuade other people to view them a certain way. How does this play out? This plays out non-verbally in the way that you look, the way that you dress, and your posture, and how you interact with non-verbally with other people. So for example, you go to a job interview. We all know that at a job interview, you have to show up 15 minutes before the scheduled time of the interview. That's a non-verbal way to demonstrate, hey, I care about this job. I showed up, early to make sure that I'm ready for this interview. You're probably dressed really nicely in a suit or some sort of business attire, right? To show that you are non-verbally ready for this interview and that you care. And then when you get called in for the interview, I'm sure the interviewee shakes your hand and says, hey, how's it going? How are you? Going good, how are you? And you make sure you give them a strong, firm handshake. You look them in the eye. You project your voice. You answer all the questions given to you in a respectful, kind manner. You address them as Mrs. or Miss or Mr., however their title is. So you take precautions to do all of this in an interview. Why? You are engaging in identity management. You are employing communication strategies to try to influence how these interviewers view you. Obviously, you want them to view you in a positive light, so therefore you're taking the time to engage in all of these behaviors that you otherwise wouldn't engage in on a normal basis, right? Does that make sense? Hope that makes sense. So, there are a couple senses of self that I want to go over as well. The first is the perceived self. So this is the person in each of us that we believe when we are examining ourselves. What that means is when you're at home, in your bed, all alone, and you're thinking to yourself, like, who am I? What am I? What is this? It's who you truly think you are in moments of true, real self-reflection. And not many people get to see your perceived self. Sometimes nobody in your life, depending on how kind of closed off you are, protective you are about your sense of self, will get to see your perceived self. Sometimes our spouses, our parents might not ever see our true perceived selves. This type of self is the real self that you know yourself to be internally in moments of self-reflection, true, real self-reflection. The presenting self is just that. That is the self that you present out to the world on a regular daily basis. So when you go to school, when you go to work, when you're out in public, this is the public image that we let everybody know about. It is what you post on social media. It is what you put on Facebook and Instagram. And it's normally a socially approved image. So this may be this may involve a variety of identity management strategies where, in order to make yourself into your presenting self, you change your hair or you put on certain kinds of clothes, or you wear makeup, or you talk a certain way, you act a certain way. So, for example, I tend to be a little more introverted when I go to parties because I don't really like being surrounded by lots of people. I prefer kind of more one-on-one conversations. And so large groups of people are kind of not something I'm super comfortable with in communicating. And so I try, though, to socialize in groups as much as possible because I want to make sure that I am presenting a self that is socially approved. You don't want to be seen as that one kind of negative Nancy in the corner of a party that doesn't talk to anyone, right? And I know that it's more socially approved to try to integrate and socialize and talk to other people. And so because of that, I will make it an effort to try to be more social, to use my facial expressions to smile a lot and appear very friendly, and maybe have my voice be a little bit higher and more bouncy and happy than I normally would in an everyday setting, because I know that that's more socially approved in that setting. So your presenting self is still a piece of you, it's still a piece of who you are, but it's not authentically who you are. That's your perceived self. And if you investigate my perceived self really likes to be at home with my dogs in my sweatpants watching Netflix. So very different, right? So lastly, face is the name. Face, as in like your literal face, is the word. It's the name that we are given to in communication studies to discuss the socially approved identity that we present. So when I talked here in number 2 about the presenting self, constructing a presenting self that is socially approved, with it comes providing a face to people. And so, of course, this is a metaphor for this idea of I put on a face, right, that is socially approved, that works well with the societal rules of the culture or the community that I reside in. And so we engage in what we call face work. So this is the verbal and nonverbal ways that we act to maintain our face and the faces of others. So in order to make sure that we don't embarrass ourselves or stand out in any way that is not ideal, we engage in face work, and we also engage in face work for other people. So if our friend is acting inappropriately in a group setting, we may or may not apologize for our friend afterwards. That's an example of face work for someone else, right? Okay, just chatting right along in this lecture. So I talked about identity management in our last slide, and now let's dive in deeper into it and how it relates to our sense of multiple identities. So all of us have multiple identities. No one person has just one identity. So for example, I'm a dog mom, I'm a daughter, I'm Vietnamese American, I'm a teacher, I live in Southern California, I'm an American, all of this kind of stuff. I have lots of multiple identities that I belong to. And so all of you also have multiple identities that you belong to. And we refer to this in chapter 2 with our in-groups. And so we get our sense of multiple identities from our in-groups. But this also deals with not just our in-groups, but also the roles that we take on. Mom, dad, auntie, uncle, mentor, leader, all of that deals with our sense of multiple identities that we have. And so being able to construct multiple identities is a huge element of competent communication, because when you are able to construct many identities for yourself and execute them well, you're practicing that skill of adaptability that we talked about, and you're also more able to practice empathy with other people, as we also talked about in chapter 1, as being very, very necessary for competent communication. Identity management is also collaborative, very important. We perform like actors to an audience through improvisation. What that means is that we build our identities, we manage them along with other people. It kind of wouldn't really make sense to practice identity management by yourself, because who are you managing your identity for, right? So if you didn't have people interviewing you at that job interview, why would you show up anywhere early and be in a suit and have researched the organization that you're working for and making sure you have a strong handshake? Why would you do any of that? You would do that because you know that those interviewers, those people interviewing you, will respond as well in that interaction. And so that's an example of how identity management is collaborative, right? We perform our identities alongside other people. Identity management can be deliberate or unconscious. So sometimes we engage in different activities, verbal and nonverbal behaviors that are on purpose or are intentional or unconscious, meaning that we don't know that we're doing them, but we're doing them anyway. Sometimes we are super aware of managing ourselves, like at a job interview, you're probably hyper aware of what you're doing, what you look like, how fast you're talking, whether or not you are giving eye contact. You're very hyper aware of all of that. And at other times, we unconsciously act in ways that try to make an impression on others. So if you have a crush on someone, for example, you might not even realize that your voice is getting a little higher, or that you're blushing, or that you're laughing more, or that you are looking at them a little bit less or more depending on your nonverbal tendencies. You might not even be consciously aware that you're doing any of that until maybe later in hindsight you analyze your interaction. You're like, oh, I didn't even realize I was doing that. So it doesn't have to be conscious to be identity management. All right. Face-to-face identity management occurs by your behavior, obviously, as we talked about, your physical appearance, your personal items, your setting. We also identity manage not just on ourselves, so by the things we wear and how we look, but also through our setting. So if you ever come to my office on Fontana campus, you'll see that I have all my Funko Pops up. I have pictures of my dog everywhere. I have my favorite books nearby. I have a tea area because I love to drink tea and coffee. And you can see that I'm communicating a lot about my identity through those physical items that are in my office as well. We find that, of course, impression management on social media actually offers an advantage to communicators who want to manage the impressions that they make. This is because social media, as we talked about in chapter 1, is asynchronous, meaning that I can just present something, leave it there online, and then see what people comment or say about it later when I log back in or look again later. And one of the cool things about social media is that you can really construct the type of identity that you want on social media. I have friends, for example, that post about their vacations and their trips and all the great food that they go eat and all the great places that they go visit and all the different parties or events that they attend. And I look at their Instagram or their Facebook and I'm like, wow, look at how much fun these people are having. They must be so awesome to hang out with, and they just must have so much fun and be fun people. Why do I think that about them? I think that because they're managing that identity to put that out on social media, that they're fun people that like to explore new food and go to new places, and it's interesting. And so whenever you see people that are posting a lot about a certain thing, they really are trying to communicate something about their identity. And we are doing it too when we decide on post on social media. I have a friend of mine who absolutely is a gym buff. He loves going to the gym, and so he'll post all his different reps and videos of himself at the gym, lifting weights or doing whatever he does. And a lot of people are like, wow, like you're at the gym a lot. But in reality, he's only going to the gym once a day for like an hour. But you would think that he was there for like 7 hours just based off how many posts that he has about the gym. And so you can kind of see there that we put on social media the things that we want to highlight the most about ourselves. And it's safe to say that even on social media, we construct almost a whole new identity that maybe we don't always execute well face to face with other people. Like I said, if you actually met my friend that goes to the gym, he's only there for an hour, but based off his social media posts, you would think he's there, all the time, 5-6 hours a day. All right, so that is it for chapter 3. Just to recap what we learned about the self-concept as a relatively stable yet flexible set of perceptions about ourselves. We then moved on to understanding where the self comes from, and it comes from two major sources of reflected appraisal and social comparison. We then learned about how the self-concept plays out in communication settings through the self-fulfilling prophecy, as well as through identity management. We also learned about the two different kinds of selves, the perceived self and the presenting self. We learned that we construct the presenting self through face work and saving face, which is a metaphor for this idea of practicing the varying ways that we engage in communicative behaviors with other people in order to influence the way they think about us and see us as well. And ultimately, we're trying to construct an identity in front of other people that is similar to what we want to present. So if we want to be perceived a certain way, we try to act in ways that other people can catch on to those communication behaviors and think that of us. All right, so that was it for chapter 3. I hope that was super helpful.